Oh, coffee, so good. Use a little sugar though. Oh, hey, hi. Welcome to the course of world history. I'm Mr. Samuelson. Today we're going to be talking about the transatlantic slave trade and sugar. All right, our essential question is, why did the practice of African slavery begin? And why did it accelerate in the Caribbean? Where's my sugar? All right, traditional slavery. Slavery was not this new invention at the time of transatlantic slave trade. Africans being transported across the Atlantic to serve as slaves was a continuation of previous practices, and it was a worse form of it. Let's be upfront about that. Because the traditional forms of African slavery were very similar to traditional forms of slavery that you would find in various parts of the world at various points in world history. That being that there were generally two different types of slaves. One were called indentured servants. Indentured servants owed a debt, and you could be enslaved as a way to pay off that debt. But this type of indentured servant would be free after a set period of time. You could sign up for indentured servitude and set through a contract the amount of time in which you would serve as a slave. And this was happening in Africa. It was common in other parts of the world as well, including Europe. Another form of slavery was one that was very similar to serfdom. Again, what you would see in Europe was also happening in Africa, in which case somebody might be tied to a particular village and be forced to serve the leaders of that village or that city, but weren't the same type of slavery that we see in the transatlantic slave trade. This was a much kinder, gentler form of slavery that many times had slaves treated, reasonably well. Slaves, but treated reasonably well within this system because it was common and people didn't stay slave for their entire life. Now, the slave trade changes when Europeans begin purchasing slaves from Africa for other purposes. And African leaders start to see the ability to profit from the selling of slaves. And once you can profit, once you can get these other goods that you really want, slavery expands. Pretty soon, slavery becomes the official punishment for most crimes. So you commit a crime, you become a slave, and then you're sold off. This is so profitable that wars spark up, particularly in West Africa, between different groups for the purpose of capturing slaves and selling them to the market. Now, during these slave raids, you would use weapons traditionally bought from Europeans. And how would you pay for those weapons? You would pay for them with slaves. So this system of defending yourself with European weapons and going to capture slaves to sell them to gain access to European weapons became this self-perpetuating problem. Now, this trade expands dramatically when Europeans conquer large chunks of the Americas. And when Europeans were visiting Africa, they less and less were interested in the raw materials from Africa. They were finding other sources for those raw materials. And more they were coming to Africa just to engage in the slave trade. And so these big compounds, forts, they were called slave factories, were established on the coasts. They looked like this. And they were large compounds designed to hold enslaved persons until ships could arrive to purchase those slaves and then take them across the Atlantic Ocean. And these were famous for being just completely brutal, horrible places. Now, as brutal as those slave forts were, the middle passage, that crossing from Africa to the New World, was even worse. And many Africans did not survive this voyage. The food quality was very poor. The water was stagnant and disgusting and usually had a fair amount of bacteria in it. The ships were enormously overcrowded. Try to imagine spending 60 days crossing the Atlantic Ocean and this is the condition that you're kept in. This led to really bad sanitation. There are no bathrooms, which led to the spread of disease and dysentery. Dysentery caused further dehydration and was a leading cause of death on these ships. It was not uncommon for a ship to lose 20% of the enslaved persons on board, which in documents you can find distressingly referred to as cargo. So they would expect to lose a fifth of their cargo on each voyage to disease and dysentery and etc. Really disgusting stuff. This is another image shown of one of these slave ships. Gives you an image. This would just be the top. Keep in mind, all of these people would be stacked like so. So it's really horrendous conditions. Now, because death rates were high, they just packed more and more people aboard and made the conditions even tighter. It made the death rates go up, but in balance, they wound up being more profitable. Sugar. Sugar winds up being what's really driving this. Before the discovery of the New World, sugar was an incredibly expensive crop. Like, for a birthday present, you might get a member of the royalty a small dish of sugar. It was so expensive and so dear that this was so expensive, it might be something that somebody received as a birthday present only, and only amongst the richest members of society. But sugar plantations take really well to the Caribbean and Brazil. And these plantations, run by the Spanish and the Portuguese, become a tremendous source of wealth. And as you can get wealthy from growing sugar, more people grow sugar. And so we start to have more and more and more sugar. And the technology improves. The Spanish and Portuguese figure out how to do this a little bit better. Prices start to drop. As the price goes down, demand for sugar increases, and more people are enslaved expressly for the purpose of harvesting and processing sugar. 11.5 million Africans were enslaved largely for this purpose, for working on the plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil. Now, Caribbean sugar plantations required a tremendous amount of labor. This is why the demand for African slaves was so high. For example, a small 500-acre plantation, and this is kind of like the minimum size that you need to be profitable, is 500 acres. This would require about 300 laborers to operate, almost all of whom would be enslaved persons. Now, this work was extremely hard. The conditions were horrible. It was hot, it was humid, disease-infested out in that area. So mortality rates are extremely high. So a lot of laborers needed. Laborers are dying. Slave labor becomes much in demand. People are always needing to buy slaves. And the demand for slave labor was never higher anywhere in the world than it was in the Caribbean and Brazil during this time. But it all ties into the profits. It was extremely profitable. And for about 100 years, the Spanish and Portuguese dominate this sugar trade because they're the ones who control the Caribbean and Brazil. But during the 1600s, France and Britain start to get into this game, and they start to win their own Caribbean islands from the Spanish. See, they'd have these conflicts in Europe, and as a part of the settlement at the end of the war, France or Britain might demand certain properties from Spain, and sometimes those were Caribbean properties. That's usually how this wound up happening. It's not the only way. But by 1660, 4 major European powers were competing to produce sugar and further drive up demand for enslaved labor. Now, this one does mention the Dutch, and yes, the Dutch are there, but I don't really consider them to be a major player in the sugar trade. The major player was Portugal, which is located in Brazil, which is off this map. So we wound up with Spanish, French, English, and Portugal being the main players in the sugar trade. So what about the 13 colonies? Good old USA. We have to talk about them, but this is really a minor player in this discussion on the slave trade. Slaves were imported to the 13 British colonies in North America. That was definitely happening. 600,000 Africans were transported across the Atlantic and wound up in bondage in the United States. Okay, that's more than 500,000 people, which is a tragedy and a crime against humanity. In comparison, and I just want to lay this out there, in comparison, it was 11.5 million going to the Caribbean and Brazil compared to what came to the United States. So in U.S. history, we focus a lot on this, rightfully so. Now take the perspective of how much bigger an organization this was throughout the Caribbean and South America. And this is why most Caribbeans today are Afro-Caribbeans with African descent. That is the majority on every major Caribbean island, with the possible exception of Cuba, which has a lot of Hispanic background, Puerto Rico too. But a lot of the others are largely Afro-Caribbean. All right. Thank you very much for watching our lesson today. I hope you learned something, and farewell.